to begin the evening by mentioning that McMaster University recognizes and acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Secondly, I want to welcome Professor Jason Stanley here tonight and thank him for participating in the speaker series, The Resisting University in a Time of Tyranny, a series that is hosted with the support of the Department of English and Cultural Studies and the McMaster Center for Scholarship in the Public Interest. These events are only made possible through the hard work and support of a number of people, and as such, I want to extend my deep appreciation to my executive assistant, Christy Caricato, Colin Zanata, our media consultant, and to my student, Zachary Gann. Thirdly, I want to say something about the purpose of the series and then come back to why we invited Professor Stanley. This lecture series was founded on the commitment to reclaim higher education as a center of critique and as a public good, one that highlights the role of academics as public intellectuals. In a time of collapsing visions, increasing cynicism, and an epidemic of violence, it's crucial for intellectuals to take a stand without standing still, display the courage of ethical conviction by engaging pressing social issues and refusing a politics of guarantees. In a similar manner, Edward Said argued that for academics to defend the possibility and necessity of the public intellectual, this is an intellectual who doesn't simply consolidate power, but questions it, connects their work to the alleviation of human suffering, enters the public sphere in order to deflate the claims of triumphalism, and recalls those dangerous memories that are often forgotten or ignored. Intellectuals, in this sense, do more than keep a particular discourse going or simply map out and advocate positions. They take a stand, and they do so with the greatest possible sense of justice, if not courage. The role of educators as public intellectuals has never been more important, especially at a time when they're under attack across the globe by far-right extremists intent on turning them into agents of indoctrination, bigotry, and propaganda. Education has always been the substance of politics, but it's rarely understood as a site of struggle over agency, identities, values, and the future itself. Education should be a practice of freedom that embraces democratic values and its role as a public good. Unfortunately, it can also be a force for domination. And a clear instance of education as a practice of repression is America's turn towards authoritarian politicians who are implementing pedagogies of repression, banning books, eviscerating voting rights, eliminating women's reproductive rights, and writing history in the language of white nationalism. Make no mistake, this view of education represents an updated fascist politics in which thinking becomes dangerous, language is emptied of any substance, a culture of questioning is denounced, teachers are fired, if not criminalized, and institutions that serve the public good begin to disappear. We live in an historical moment in which education has taken on a new role in the age of upgraded fascism. This is a colonizing culture of education with its wide array of indoctrination practices, which have become the principal instruments used by the right to create a culture of misinformation, implement and expand the politics of racial and social abandonment, and align power and consciousness with the forces of repression. One consequence is that democratic institutions and public spheres, especially higher and public education, are under assault. We have invited Professor Stanley here tonight because he has not only bravely addressed the rise of fascist politics, both in the United States and across the globe, but also because his work provides an invaluable analysis of the crucial role that education can play, both as a form of domination, especially in the context of the emerging fascism, and how it might also function as a politics for social change and social justice. He has written with great dignity, courage, and scholarship for some years about what it means not only to be a scholar and public intellectual, but also what it means to take personal and professional risks in order to challenge the poisonous nature of authoritarianism, historical amnesia, and white supremacy. He has insisted on the power of education as a central element of individual empowerment and collective struggle. He reminds us that educators and other cultural workers have a responsibility to embrace a vision and language that enables them to both defend learning as a tool of critical analysis and informed judgment, and provide modes of critical literacy and opportunities for people to think, act, and collectively engage in social change in an imaginative way. He is clear in his call for educators, students, artists, and other cultural workers to face the challenge of believing that their work matters and that they can produce knowledge that is politically driven, critical, and opens up new analytic horizons. In addition, he provides a model in his own writing for educators and others to lift knowledge into the public realm, making it understandable and meaningful. I have to say, he's one of the few people I read who really who refuses the dichotomy between something being rigorous and being clear. He believes that you can be rigorous and clear at the same time, and it shines in his writing. Let me cite a brief excerpt from his groundbreaking book, How Fascism Works, which I believe in some way captures an element of the project that he's been involved in for some time. He says, fascist politicians justify their ideas by breaking down a common sense of history and creating a mythic past to support their vision for the present. They rewrite the population's shared understanding of reality by twisting the language of ideals through propaganda and promoting anti-intellectualism, attacking universities and educational systems that might challenge their ideas. Eventually, with those techniques, fascist politics creates a state of unreality in which conspiracy theories and fake news replace reasoned debate. Professor Stanley is the Jacob Urowsky Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. He's an authority on propaganda, fascism, the philosophy of language, and other things, and writes on a range of social issues. His most recent books include How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, and How Propaganda Works. He's also a political commentator and has been interviewed and provided commentary on a number of prominent social platforms and media sites. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Stanley.
Thank you so much, Henry. And let me just say that Professor Giroux has been doing the kind of work that I am trying to do for decades. He's a path breaker and a model for me. He worked alongside figures like Paulo Freire, who are vilified in, say, Brazilian politics, vilified across the world for their emancipatory visions. And Professor Giroux has just been, as they say, on it. And this is the time for the work that he has been doing. And I'm, to have him say those words about the work I'm doing is for me quite remarkable. So what I want to talk about today is my new book. It was originally titled Schooling for Fascism. It's now titled Erasing History. And it is about the global authoritarian attack on education. And let me just say how it relates to my previous book, How Fascism Works. How Fascism Works was about fascist politics. This book, so fascist politics is the kind of politics that people employ to the kind of politics that people employ in order to overcome democracy and install admiration for a leader. What you have in the case of hold on for a second, Henry, are you in the main screen or? Okay, good. So fascist politics is a method, is the kind of politics that you use in order to make citizens think that democracy is their enemy, that democracy is a threat. And so you need to replace democracy by something more in the character of authoritarianism. So there are various tropes of fascist politics with which we're now quite familiar. For instance, great replacement theory, that the place where we are, there's in Madison Grant's 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race, he says Nordic whites are the great race of the United States. And he warns that they will be replaced by immigrants and who breed more than Nordic whites. This is also, of course, when Donald Trump talked about shithole countries. Why do we only have immigration from shithole countries and not from, say, Sweden or Norway? This is the kind of thing He's adverting to this model of the great race. The Madison Grant calls Nordic whites the native peoples of the United States. Hitler greatly admired Madison Grant's work. Now, great replacement theory is a major trope in fascist politics. When you employ great replacement theory, that enables people, that makes people, we know from my colleague Jennifer Richardson's work, it drives people to the right, even to the far right. So fascist politics is a series of tropes, like, for instance, Professor Giroux talked about the mythic past. The mythic past is a trope that enables great replacement theory, because you say, in the past, we were great. The dominant group in our nation was great. And if we lose this dominance, if we lose, for instance, the dominance of whites in the United States, then we will cease to be great. In India, the Hindutva movement, Hindu nationalism, represents India's past as pure Hindu, a pure Hindu past. And so the threat is that Muslims and will take over, non-Hindus will take over, and thereby threaten, replace Hindus' cultural, political, and numerical dominance. So in this kind of structure, you represent the minority groups as breeding, as having many children because they're somehow more like animals. These are the kinds of tropes of fascist politics. So my book, Erasing History, is about how the education systems make fascist politics effective. Why does anyone believe that there is a great race? Why does anyone believe that white men are the great men of the United States? And by replacing white people, white Christians, you're threatening the greatness of the United States. Why is this effective at all? My current book, Erasing History, is an answer to that question. It's the central driver of fascist politics is the way to prepare a people to be hostage to the representations and practices of authoritarianism is via its education system. And this is clearly recognized by authoritarians all over the world. Viktor Orbán in Hungary, in his run in 2010 for prime minister, he targeted Central European University as a hotbed of Marxists and gender ideology, and who were threatening Hungary as a nation. You see right now in Russia, in the occupied territories of Ukraine, Russia is immediately rushed in to replace the textbooks, by textbooks that completely erased Ukrainian history. The Russian textbooks themselves in Russian schools inside Russia proper have been replaced in order to make the kind of mobilization required for this kind of violent authoritarian fascism practiced by Putin's regime more effective. So you see again and again people paying attention to this. Wow, what are they doing with the education systems? What are they doing with the schools? Well, when you change the schools, then you change people's receptivity to messages. So, I mean, this just strikes me anecdotally that one time back when I was on social media, I'd gone to a public school in Syracuse, New York, and we had this kind of Holocaust-denying history teacher who would say bizarre things about World War II. And on Facebook, I was talking to someone who was in that class, and he said, well, Hitler was part Jewish, wasn't he? 30 years later, he still believed the lies he was told in high school. So this is something authoritarians know everywhere, that changing the education system prepares people for the myths that help them, that help their war against democracy. So essentially, your political structure is based upon your education system. If you want authoritarianism, you need to educate for authoritarianism. If you want democracy, you need to educate for democracy. And this has been long known in political philosophy. It has been forgotten recently, but for centuries, indeed millennia, this was known. After all, Plato's Republic is a work in philosophy of education. Plato focuses on the education system of Callipolis, his ideal city. And because he knows that to create an ideal city, to create his idea, to create any political system, you need to describe the education system. It's almost like for centuries, political philosophy took the form of describing an education system, as in Plato's Republic. Rousseau's Emile, a kind of bizarre education, but this too, it's very clear that in Rousseau, the founder of social contract theory, one of the founders with Hobbes of social contract theory, the education system, the education is central to his vision of a just society, of a democratic society. So you have this recognized in political philosophers all the way up to John Rawls, who never really addresses or takes the question of education seriously. It's all about principles of justice, not how you achieve a just society. Achieving a just society requires having an education system that educates people to be inured, to be resistant to authoritarian messaging. This was something long known. Every philosophy department in America had a philosopher of education until the 1970s. And now very few leading philosophy departments have a philosopher of education because political philosophy forgot the centrality of education. You cannot disagree. So my book, at least the first half, the part I'm going to talk you through now, is about educating for fascism, or educating for authoritarianism, let's say. It's about the kinds of education systems that are being developed across the world so that people start thinking that democracy, that authoritarianism is less of a threat to them than democracy. So that's what I want to discuss. So my book takes, or this part of my book, I'm going to present to you, I'm going to sketch the first roughly 60% of the book. The book is the first the first 60% or 65% or whatever is called problems, and the last part is called solutions. So I'm just going to give you the chapters, since I'm not going to do PowerPoint. I'm going to tell you. So the chapter 1 is called Colonialist Education. Chapter 2 is called Nationalist Education. Chapter 3 is called Fascist Education. And chapter 4 is called Anti-Education. Those are the parts that I'm going to sketch for you today. In the solution, attempts at a solution, the part 2 of the book, chapter 5 is called Classical Education. Chapter 6 is called Decolonial Education. And chapter 7 is called Anti-Authoritarian Education. So I won't discuss those here. So the thought in the book, and what I'm trying to do in this project, is show how. Well, let me back up for a second. I think of political systems as sets of practices and representations, what Rahel Jaegi, the German philosopher, calls forms of life. So there are fascist. So there are certain educational practices. So colonialist education will be colonialist educational practices and representations. And what I want to do is I want to sketch how fascist education, and then ultimately I want to look at the anti-education, the final chapter. But at first I'm going to build up to how fascist education emerges from the practices and representations of colonialist education and certain forms of nationalist education. Now, so I'm going to begin on a personal note. My father wrote his dissertation, published his dissertation he finished his dissertation in 1963 or 1964. It was called Origins of Change, a British Education and the Construction of the East African Intellectual. And it was about, and he focused on two educational institutions in Kenya, where he spent 3 years, Alliance High School and Makerere University. These were, incidentally, the schools that Ngugi wa Thiong'o attended at around the same time that my father was there. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I believe, entered Makerere in the fall of 1959. So there's decolonizing the mind has been, as a result, quite central to my thinking here. So my father was in Kenya at a time after what we now know was a horrific gulag. The British erected concentration camps in which they tortured people and murdered. Nobody knows how many Kikuyu they murdered, but there was an uprising against the British called the Mau Mau Rebellion. The British called them the Mau Mau, the Kikuyu rebels. They called themselves the Land and Freedom Army because the British had stolen their land. And they were trying to do to the Kikuyu what was done to indigenous people in North America, pen them in reservations and seize all the land. That's what they did. So Kenyan independence is in 1962, and it comes after this horrific history. And these schools, Alliance High School, to take a look with the Alliance High School, which Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his memoirs talks about a lot. They were meant to extinguish Kikuyu identity. My father in his dissertation talks about how the graduates of Alliance High School could smoothly rattle off all the British royal families dating back, members of the British royal family dating back hundreds of years, but had never taken a single course on the history of their own country. They knew nothing of the history of their own country, but they knew everything about British history. The schools represented Kenya as having no history, and the schools were intended to extinguish any kind of native identity. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about how if you were caught speaking Kikuyu if you're taught speaking Kikuyu, you were forced to wear a sign forced to wear a sign for the rest of the day, either I am a donkey or I am stupid. So there was a concerted effort to erase Kikuyu identity. And you find this across the world with colonialism. The effort to extinguish indigenous identity and replace it by some other identity. The motto of Richard Chapman, the founder of the Carlisle School for Indigenous People, his motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man." So the idea was you had to extinguish the indigenous identity and replace it with the colonial identity. So colonialist educational practices involved extinguishing indigenous identity and giving people a perspective that was that of the colonizer. So now there's a complexity here to representing the colonizer as the only people with a true history. Now there's some complexity here because there's two kinds of it seems on the surface that there's two kinds of colonialist educational practices. We could call them education for extinction. This is the name of a famous book on the indigenous boarding schools of the late 19th and early 20th century, and education for submission, and you can think of the latter as the kind of thing that happened at the Hampton Institute, say, where where, oh, so sorry, I messed up the name of the I messed up the name of the founder of the Carlisle School. I gave you instead the Minister of Education of Hawaii. I'll get to that in a minute. But so in Black education, in the education of Black Americans in the South, the goal was not to make them think they were white, right? The goal was not to erase their identity and replace it by white identity. No one was interested in that project. The goal instead was to get them, train them for industrial education, to tell them they had no history, they were an uncivilized people, and their future was as laborers. So it's more education for submission. So you can think of these as two different structures, education for extinction and education for submission. But they have a lot more in common than meets the eye. Right. So right. Sorry about that. As I was thinking, Samuel Chapman Armstrong founded the Hampton School. So Samuel Chapman Armstrong. So if you take that model of education for submission versus education for extinction, you might think that there are two very different educational structures here. But the historical ties between them are very intimate. Samuel Chapman Armstrong was the person who established the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute that trained Black teachers and essentially trained Black Americans for industrial education. Samuel Chapman Armstrong was the son of Richard Armstrong, who was the Minister of Education of Hawaii for Minister of Public Instruction of Hawaii, appointed in 1847. Writing about Hawaiians, so this is the father of the founder of the Hampton Institute. Writing about Hawaiians, Armstrong stated, this is a lazy people, and if they are ever to be made industrious, the work must begin with the young. So I am making strenuous efforts to have some sort of manual labor connected with every school. Without industry, they cannot be moral. Central to the educational systems, the Hawaiian colonialist education system, the Kenyan colonialist education system, was Christianity. So Richard Armstrong was himself a Christian missionary. The indigenous boarding schools in America were no different. Christianity was utterly central to these colonialist projects. They wanted to replace the indigenous identities with Christianity. Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about this at length in his memoirs as well. The only truth was the cross, he says. Now, the idea, so Richard Armstrong, who is the Minister of Public Instruction of Hawaii, who openly said Hawaiians are lazy, we must force them to work, and we must Christianize them. He's the father of the person who founded the Hampton Institute, which was for Black Americans, and where Booker T. and Samuel Chapman Armstrong, the founder of the Hampton Institute, was of course the person who the sort of mentor of Booker T. Washington, who pushed for industrial education rather than democratic education for Black Americans. So it's really difficult to separate the projects, historically speaking. The project of education for submission and the project of education for extinction are very difficult to separate. In both cases, you're talking, the ideology is that the colonized people are savages with no history who are lazy, and they must be Christianized, forced to work. The center of education is Christianity and manual labor. So this is now, there are different forms of colonial education. There were other kinds of colonial education that tried to produce little replicas of British people. But in all of the cases, the representation of the colonized people was as people with no history, people who had to be Christianized in order to be civilized, where the civilization process could take one of a variety of forms, of manual laborers for the colonizers, or as people who themselves would implement the colonizers' agenda, as in India and as in East Africa, where the post-colonial elite simply replaced the British in the fancy homes in the White Highlands, and replicated their practices. So there's a structure to colonialist education that involves representing the colonizer's history as the only genuine history, and representing the colonizer as the only people with a history, and then representing the colonized as lazy, and the function of the education system was to force them to work. Now, this idea throughout this is throughout a sort of through line through colonization and fascism is the identification of human value with industrial efficiency. So it's no accident that over the gates of Auschwitz, the slogan was "Arbeit macht frei," work shall make you free, although it was massively hypocritical to put that on top of a death camp. So now we have in the American Black intellectual tradition a lengthy history of pushback against this kind of white colonial education. So Du Bois's magisterial 1935 book, Black Reconstruction in America, is a 700+ page reply to what he calls in the final chapter, the propaganda of history. That is the miseducation supporting white supremacy. So the representation, so Du Bois talks about how Du Bois sketches the kind of history that was taught at institutions like Columbia University, where professors said things like, the American Negroes are the only people in the history of the world, as far as I know, that ever became free without any effort of their own. And Du Bois in Black Reconstruction shows that enslaved Americans indeed had agency in freeing themselves. The point of the book, one of the major points of the book, is to show that the 200,000 Black soldiers who participated in the Union Army in various ways, and the sort of work stoppages that enslaved Black Americans engaged in the South were central to the Union victory. So what you did, white education. One time I was teaching in the Wesleyan prison program, and we were talking about the students' education, and one of the students said, "Well, I quit high school as soon as I was told that Abraham Lincoln single-handedly freed the slaves." So this idea that, an all-white army with a white president just took it upon themselves to fight the South and end slavery as a practice. This myth got perpetuated really throughout my education as well. Even though Du Bois challenges it, it's destroyed by Du Bois already in 1935. So this idea of the colonized people having no agency, having no history and no agency, is central to colonialist education. So I want us to keep that in mind. That's central to colonialist education, is the representation of the colonized as having no history and no agency. Now I want to turn to nationalist education as a build-up to fascist education. So So we've talked about colonialist education that represents the colonized as lazy, lacking history, in need of discipline, lacking agency, lacking historical agency. What about the other side? What about the representation of the colonizer? And here we get to here we have to look at nationalism, at the kind of education that forms a national identity. And it can form a national identity in different ways. And what I want to focus on is the kind of national identity that undergirds fascism, that undergirds fascist education. So, so what you have, and when you look at fascist, at colonization, at fascist practices today, if you look at the justifications given for Israel's occupation of Palestine, for instance, they come from this idea that, say, in this case, Israel is somehow, mythically and historically a pure Jewish nation. It is given it's innocent of any crimes, and it is merely defending itself against people who wish to overthrow it. And this is a justification for the brutal suppression of another people who have equal rights to that land. So fascist practices are based on a nation perpetuates fascist practices on others, including internally colonized people, when they have a certain conception of themselves. And that conception is one I wish to unpack and elucidate. However, when you begin with the topic of nationalism, you have to recognize at the outset that there must be forms of nationalism that do not allow for a fascist project. I was in Ukraine over the summer teaching a summer school on fascism and colonialism. And one of the things the students wanted to talk most about, the students were also professors and journalists, and was how do you avoid, so in a time of war, as Ukraine is experiencing now, it's important to be nationalist. Ukraine wants to preserve its own history. Russia wants to say Ukraine has no history. Russia wants to say Ukrainian identity is fake. They're just really Russian. So they're going to erase any independent Ukrainian identity. That's what they're doing in the occupied territories of Ukraine. They're putting in textbooks that have that represent the only history of the region being essentially Soviet history and Russian history, with no independent path of Ukrainian history. So the Ukrainian war, the fight against the Russian occupiers, of necessity involves a certain kind of nationalism. And the discussion that was very salient and alive in Ukraine when I was there was, after Ukraine wins, how do you prevent the bad kind of Ukrainian nationalism from taking over? And this turns out to be something that Fanon theorizes about in his essay on violence. He says, nationalism is required in the anti-colonial struggle, but once you win the struggle, it has to transform itself. We can think of the nationalism that undergirds fascist, well, actually, I don't want to think of it. I think even during the anti-colonial struggle, you don't want that self-aggrandizing nationalism that undergirds fascism. But there are acceptable forms of nationalism that are even required in an anti-colonial struggle. So, losing your identity as a people. Now you could, is not advisable when under occupation. You need to have an identity, a history of your own. And this requires a certain kind of nationalism. Now, anti-colonial struggles can also involve can also seem a nationalism can arise that is kind of fascistic. My own view is Hamas is a kind of fascistic organization that employs the wrong kind of nationalist ideology to justify brutal and unacceptable actions against Israeli civilians. However, there are acceptable forms of necessary forms of Palestinian nationalism in the face of this brutal occupation and subjugation of the Israelis. And so we have to tease apart the kind of nationalism that undergirds. I used to think of it as dominant group nationalism versus oppressed group nationalism. But now I think that there can be versions of nationalism of oppressed groups that nevertheless can justify unacceptable acts. So what are acceptable? What are the kinds of nationalist educations that don't lead to fascist practices of domination and subjugation versus the kind of nationalist educational practices that do prepare a country to dominate and subjugate others? That is a vital question. Now, we can start with just national identity, like an acceptable nationalist education treats people as having a history, as having their own history, not a history that's greater than the history of others. But it's perfectly fine for schools in Finland to spend a lot of time on Finnish history. That is totally acceptable and to be expected. It is fine to give a people a national identity. It's fine for your country's schools should teach the history of that country. It's precisely why it's so horrifying that in the British schools in East Africa, they did not teach any history of the local regions. They represented Kenya or the different tribes in Kenya as having no history of their own. So yes, it is perfectly acceptable to have an education that emphasizes the history of a people. And it's required even in anti-colonial struggles. But that is an acceptable form of nationalism. Where it tilts into well, I'll get to that in a second. We can also distinguish different bases for national identity. So we can think of, Fichte in the addresses to the German nation was sort of the origin of national, origin story of nationalism, as it were, at least in my field of philosophy. His nationalism is linguistic. The Germans are those who speak German. And then he argues that German is a superior language to other languages, to French, for instance. So German is the true inheritor of the Greek tradition. Now, we don't have to get into Fichte interpretation here, but what I want to extract from this is this idea of language as the defining feature of a nation. Hannah Arendt in Origins of Totalitarianism says that nationalism becomes truly genocidal when it is race-based, when it's based on racial differences. And this certainly accounts for a number of 20th century genocides. However, it doesn't account. It's very clear that there are a number of essentially fascistic genocides that are not based on racial nationalism. So what Russia is doing in Ukraine now is not based on racial nationalism, because Russian nationalist ideology is that Ukrainians really are Russian. So there's like a hidden Russian, and they're just the exterior Ukrainian is somehow fake. So that's not racial nationalism. It is linguistic nationalism. So linguistic nationalism can be genocidal. And then you have genocides that are hard to explain on either of these frames. The Hutu and Tutsi speak the same language. They have the same religion, traditional religion. They are, for all intents and purposes, the same people. Yet, nevertheless, the rupture in the identity justified for the Hutu genocide. So I don't think there's a simplistic way of dividing the nationalisms that can undergird fascistic mass killing from each other. It's not racial nationalism versus linguistic nationalism. What I think it is, it is a kind of now, just to sketch various forms of nationalism. The nationalism that undergirds Nazism was German racial nationalism, and again and again, I've been finding in books on Nazi education that before National Socialism, one of the problems was even in Weimar Republic, the education system was problematically nationalist, which paved the way for the later, much more extreme versions of nationalism that came later under the Nazis. So it's a gradation, and we have to investigate where on that gradation, from simply representing a people as having a history and teaching that history to, these people are the great race or the great people, and they're destined to dominate over others. We have to figure out or worry about this gradation, because it clearly is a gradation. Now, if you look at the United States right now, you might really worry. So what I'm going to suggest is the nationalism that undergirds fascist education, the kind of nationalism that undergirds nationalist education that undergirds fascist education, represents the dominant group in the nation as world historically great. This is and we're going to talk about the methods of representing the dominant national group as world historically great in a moment. Now, when you look at the United States today, I think we should deeply worry about the form of nationalism that we see. Now, U.S. racial nationalism, unlike German nationalism in the in National Socialism, is strongly linked to Christianity. So German the kind of nationalism that undergirded Nazism was not essentially Christian; it was essentially racial. U.S. racial, but other versions of fascist nationalism were clearly intermingled with Christianity. Romanian fascism, for instance, was intricately involved with Christianity. U.S. racial nationalism is clearly strongly linked to Christianity. In its current form, it's white Christian nationalism. And according to this version of nationalism, the United States is the world's greatest nation, and its greatness is due to the white Christian men who were its founders. And so this kind of talk of the United States as the greatest nation in history, as ordained by God to rule the world. This is a clearly problematic form of nationalism. It's clearly the kind of, justificatory nationalism for mass killing and mass violence. So and you find these distinctions between acceptable forms of nationalism and dangerous forms of nationalism throughout the literature on nationalism and imperialism. So towards the beginning of his classic 1902 work, Imperialism, a Study, J.A. Hobson describes a version of nationalism that is not imperialist in character, but instead leans into the internationalist ideal of the brotherhood of humanity. So as he says, a true strong internationalism in form or spirit would rather imply the existence of powerful, self-respecting nationalities which seek union on the basis of common national needs and interests. So, Hobson says true internationalism should be different national groups respecting each other equally and seeking and seeing that they have common interests. And Hobson contrasts this form of nationalism with a nationalist project which, quote, glows with the animus of greed and self-aggrandizement. Now, when you look at American nationalism, it has always glowed with the animus of greed and self-aggrandizement. It's not the kind of nationalism that says, oh, Canada's just as good as us, Mexico is just as good as us, we're three nations sitting together. That is not American nationalism. So we should always worry about the kind of nationalism we see in the United States. So I've said that an unproblematic form of nationalism would be one that, accentuates the common history of the national group. But it's more than that. It's that the common history of the national group must include the nation's sins as well as its victories. If you obliterate the sins of a nation, and every nation is born in blood, if you obliterate those sins, well, then you're representing the national group as innocent. And since they're innocent, well, any crimes they do really aren't, any killings or violence they do really would be justified just by self-protection, something like that. So national innocence is not an aspect of an unproblematic nationalism must confront its history directly. It says, we're all Canadian, but being Canadian means we have to look at what happened to our indigenous populations, the crimes that were done to our indigenous population as part of the formation of our nation. If you excise that history, then you're going away from an unproblematic form of nationalism into a problematic form of nationalism. So, and these are incredibly difficult to, even when you're facing it proves to be incredibly difficult to face directly a nation's past sins. I could go into even why even the German education system that I experienced as a high school student in Germany in the 1980s did not directly confront what happened. Essentially, the story we were told was the Holocaust was Auschwitz. In Auschwitz were the death camps. In the death camps, the guards were all Slavs, and they were run by the SS, who were like these scary, crazy people who weren't really normal Germans. And the ordinary German didn't know about this. So if Auschwitz is the Holocaust, then the ordinary German didn't know about it and didn't do it. It was the Slavs and those monsters, the SS. But this turned out to be an exculpatory history, because every German has a grandfather who served in the Wehrmacht. And the Wehrmacht, as we know from Christopher Browning, the Wehrmacht was made up of ordinary men who shot millions of people over pits before they ever made it to concentration camps. So but if you say so, and so this is now known as the Holocaust of bullets, which was not a concept that was formulated until like 2010. So the way you were taught history, even in the country that faces their history the best, Germany, was still exculpatory. Because now, and even so, here's another form of nationalism that looks on the surface like it's unproblematic, but actually still has problematic elements. And that's the Nicole Hannah-Jones's 1619 project. Nicole Hannah-Jones's project, at least the lead essay, represents the United States as a great nation. And it represents the United States as sort of singularly great. And then it argues that its greatness is due in large part to its Black citizens. And I don't disagree. I absolutely think it's an essential project to argue to show Black agency in the good parts of US history. However, the wealth and power of the United States does not simply rest upon the exploitation of its Black population. It rests upon our colonial wars. It rests upon the environmental degradation of other countries that is the result of our wealth and our consumption of the world's resources. So if you ignore, so the United States' wealth is not simply due to the slavery, slavery and the legacy of slavery. There are other peoples in the world whose suffering contributed to America's prosperity, and the 1619 Project sort of elides that. In fact, it celebrates the patriotism of Black Americans who fought in the nation's wars. But the nation's wars, many of the nation's wars, were completely unjust. So, in fact, Nicole Hannah-Jones's project is an American exceptionalist project. It's just that she's saying that American exceptionalism is partly due to the greatness of Black Americans. Right. So she describes the United States as right. She writes. She talks about how her father always raised the American flag in front of our house. And she says, he knew that our people's, meaning Black Americans, our people's contributions to building the richest and most powerful nation in the world were indelible. Right. But there were also a lot of world historical crimes done to other nations in building the richest and most powerful nation in the world. So now the fact that even this American exceptionalist project is attacked gets attacked, as it has been. It's I think it's the only book that has ever been banned by name and by multiple laws. But what that shows, given that it is an American nationalist project, even an American exceptionalist project, is that it's white nationalism that is responsible for the attack. It can't be American nationalism, because the 1619 Project is an American nationalist project. It's saying this country is exceptional and great and the most greatest country in the world, and it's because of it's mainly or partly or largely or a significant part of its greatness is because of Black Americans. And then the reaction is, this is attacking America. It can't possibly be attacking America. It's an American exceptionalist project. So really the attack is, it's attacking America because America is being identified with white America. Okay, so we've distinguished at least two varieties of nationalist education. One that looks squarely at a nation's history and says, this is who we are, these are the bad things we've done, these are the good things we've done, this is what ties us together, is this common national history, a common set of errors, common set of triumphs, and a self-aggrandizing form of nationalism that undergirds the claim that that nation is the greatest in the world. And now I want to really conclude with fascist education. Let me quickly break to ask, how long can I go? Another 10 minutes? Does that work?
Yes, 10 minutes
Okay.
is fine.
Okay. So I want to begin with two quotes from Adolf Hitler. One is our educational, this is both from Mein Kampf. One is where education is a main theme. It's funny how, like, in democratic political philosophy, they're not talking about education, whereas Mein Kampf is, education is a focus. So our educational system lacked the art of picking a few names out of the historical development of our people and making them the common property of the whole German people. Thus, through knowledge and like enthusiasm, tying a uniform uniting bond around the entire nation. They did not understand how to make the really significant men of our people appear as outstanding heroes in the eyes of the present, to concentrate the general attention on them and thus create a unified mood. So what Hitler is saying is the educational system of the Weimar Republic did not understand that what you need is you need to pick a bunch of great men who are German, of the German race, and represent them as outstanding heroes, as world historical figures. That's the structure of the kind of education system he wanted. You've got great men. He's saying what you need to do is you need to pick a bunch of great men and say these are world historical heroes, and the education system should be arranged around that. And another quote from Hitler in Mein Kampf: the goal of female education must invariably be the future mother. So now, you might think that these topics of colonialism and fascism, why are they so intimately connected? It's very clear during World War II, the links between colonialism and fascism were vivid to soldiers, well situated to see glaring hypotheses. And well, both returning Black American soldiers and returning Kenyan soldiers who had fought in World War II on the side of the Allies recognized that in their home countries they were facing the very fascism they had fought against in Europe. So the way I'm thinking about fascist education is it makes fascist politics, for instance, the fascist representations of great replacement theory, effective. Now, I just want to ruminate for a bit on Hitler's strategy. Hitler says what the education system needs to do is it must pick great men from the national race and represent them as world historical heroes. And that's how the education system should be based. So what that does as a system is it makes you think that those people, the race from which they come, the group that they represent, are a great race. And if they were replaced, it would undermine the greatness of the nation. So a fascist education system makes great replacement theory effective. It says, look at these great men who are German. Imagine losing the character imagine having all these non-Germans come in. These, non-German Christians come in, and then they're going to breed, and there's going to be more and more of them. And then, we're not going to have great men like that anymore. The greatness of the nation is because of those great men. Look again at what we're being asked to do in the United States with our education system, the kind of education system the 1776 Project is trying to tell us to do. It says, venerate the founders. Take the white Christian men that founded the nation and make them into world historical heroes. Pick the great men, the great white men from across the generations. Now, so it looks very similar to what Hitler is urging. And it makes great replacement theory effective because it makes you worry about what happens once white Christian men no longer dominate American politics. So now, in the case of the United States, there's one extra element one has to add. All of these, all of the conservatives, the right wing who are arguing for this kind of education system, all wish to add Martin Luther King as one of the great men. And you have to see why that is, even though, of course, he's not white. The reason they want to do that is because they want to say that he ended racism. And if he ended racism, it can't be around anymore. So he absolved the nation of the sin of racism, because a key characteristic of a fascist education is national innocence. So I'm going to conclude here. So one aspect is we've talked about making great replacement theory effective as a tool of fascist politics, and how an education system can do that by representing the greatness of the nation as the greatness in terms of the great exploits of members of the dominant national group. But there's another aspect as well, which is strict gender roles. You find, I haven't been talking about a major theme of my book, which is the attack on LGBT perspectives and the advancing of traditional gender roles. But this is connected to great replacement theory and the role of and the role of women. The idea is, and Masha Gessen's book, The Future is History, that was called, I think The Future is History, her 2017 book. She talks about how Putin starts talking about natalism, like the importance of having more babies as central to Russian politics. And this is a theme. This is central to fascist governments. The idea is, well, you have to preserve the dominant national group, and so women should be at home having babies. And LGBT people are threatening LGBT freedom for sexual minorities. Threatens the traditional role of women, which should be to repopulate the nation by children of the dominant national group. So fascist education is harshly anti-LGBT. And in fact, the attack on LGBT is the canary in the coal mine of encroaching authoritarianism. First, it's an attack on freedom. It's an attack on sexual freedoms. And secondly, it's motivated by a desire to keep the dominant national group in power. So you find again and again this representation of and it's also a way to get families to turn against democracy, because the democratic values of freedom and equality clearly allow LGBT practices, allow people to live as they want. And if you can get people to think that that the existence of LGBT citizens among them threatens the nation somehow, then you can get them to think that democracy threatens the nation, since democracy allows LGBT rights. So I'm going to conclude by, and of course, this way, by attacking, there's, when Hitler talks about how women are just there to procreate, he doesn't have a Christian agenda, he has a racial agenda. But in advancing that agenda, that rigid gender roles to repopulate the dominant group, he draws social conservatives and religious conservatives to support him against democracy. So fascism never wins unless it can draw in the religious right to support it, even though their agendas are somewhat different. So I'm going to conclude by listing 6 themes of 6 major themes of fascist education. There's one I didn't mention, but it also prepares you for fascist politics, which is the vilification of socialism, Marxism, and the left. So what you do is you represent Marxism and socialism as horrific, villainous structures. So what you and then you can, in fascist politics, when you describe something as Marxist, you elicit a feeling, you seek to elicit a feeling of disgust. So by teaching people that Marxism is the source of all evil and representing it in horrible ways, you can then make, then you could allow politicians to call anything Marxist and people won't like it. So the 6 major themes of fascist education are national greatness, national innocence, national purity of race, of religion, sexual orientation, etc., strict gender roles, glorification of military achievement, and vilification of socialism, Marxism, and the left. And what I've tried to do here is show how colonialist and nationalist practices structure and certain kinds of nationalist practices and orientations structure and lead into a fascist education, and how a fascist education makes the tropes of fascist politics effective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. That's fabulous. We have a series of questions, some of which are from my students. So can you see them in your participants' screen? I'll read them to you.
No. Okay.
Let's take the first one. Okay. The student says, to what extent do you see this current American Christian nationalism as linked to or even compatible with a culture dominating neoliberalism? Are the same subjects who were the victims of neoliberal capitalism the ones who are perpetrating the education of this religious freedom? Just wondering if you can comment a bit on this connection.
Well, I was stopped in the book with chapter 4, and so I couldn't get to it with chapter 3 because we can only logically, I can't really sit here and go through all of what I've written. So the next chapter is anti-education, which is the response here, the response to the question, where I confront the issue of why are libertarians funding these attacks on the schools? Why are libertarians funding essentially? Why are libertarians engaged in what I call strategic fascism? So what? Now, there's a confluence of interests between neoliberalism and white Christian nationalism. The student is absolutely right. The confluence of and Melinda Cooper, in her book Family Values, sketches this out most magnificently, where, just following her analysis, she says, look, if there's no state, who does everything? Families and churches. So libertarians are like, we want there not to be a state. We want there not to be any public goods. The Christian conservatives are like, great, then everyone has to go to their families and their churches. And those are the only institutions that we recognize. So it's a confluence of interests. The libertarians are funding this not because they want a religious education for their kids. They're not going to send their kids to the schools that they're the Christian school, to Hillsdale College. That's not going to happen. You're not going to find Peter Thiel's, not Peter Thiel. He's LGBT, but well, maybe he has a kid, but you're not going to find libertarian elites sending their kids to Hillsdale College. But they have a confluence of interests with social conservatives. Both of them want to destroy the public structures. And Melinda Cooper covers this in detail.
That's been raised is how would you feel about an education system that professes neutrality and is hinged on producing workers instead of critical thinking, using Nigeria as a case study?
So I'm much more versed in East Africa than West Africa, but the general issue of an education based on industrial efficiency and work skills is a kind of dehumanization, and this is the Booker T. Washington Du Bois debate. So someone was telling me, I was talking to someone the other day who was saying, well, I don't know what we're doing in these schools. All these students are liberal arts majors. What are they going to do with their lives? And I was like, they're going to be democratic citizens. It's true that you need work skills, but that's not the function of education. And when people are telling you it's the function of education, it's because they want you to not be agents in the construction of the policies in your own country.
And another question that I guess needs to be raised is that when we talk about neoliberalism as a pedagogical practice and how it influences schools outside of the particular narratives that at any one time are dominating, whether they're colonial or the narratives that you mentioned earlier, the various forms of ways in which history gets suppressed and then rearticulated. There's also it seems to me, this larger question of depoliticization. How, not just about historical erasure or the rewriting of history, but the question of, for instance, and you touched upon it a minute ago, and I think that Zachary, the student who asked that question, was getting at it, and that is, there's this notion of, there's two elements here that seem to me work in tandem. One, there's the notion that the government basically should not be about social responsibility. It should get out of the way. The market is the template for all social relations, and the market rules, and that draws together a whole range of social and religious and fundamentalists and fanatics, to say the least. Leave us alone. Freedom gets defined as freedom from. But there's also another question, and that is how the question of individualism is taken up in neoliberal ideology in ways that utterly depoliticize people by erasing not just simply historical narratives, but the very notion of social structures and systemic considerations. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, that's the, as Thatcher said, there are no societies. I know. But I don't think, and this is where Melinda Cooper's work is valuable. It's not like they're erasing social structures. They're leaving churches. they're leaving families. Which social structures get erased is the thing to attend to. But I also think that you can't distinguish, and this is a theme I talk about in the book, you can't distinguish erasing history from erasing social structures. Take the attack on critical race theory. I remember talking to the great U.S. historian Elizabeth Hinton about her book, America on Fire, which is about, she's describing the structures of policing and how there's always this common structure of violent militarized policing causes causes a violent a killing or an atrocity in a Black community, and then there's an uprising against the police, and then everyone agrees that they're going to change the policing structure, and then someone runs for office saying they're coddling the criminals, and then they double down on the practices of violent military policing. And I said to Elizabeth, Elizabeth, you're doing critical race theory. You're talking about structural racism. You're talking about the structures of policing. And she said, no, Jason, I'm doing history. I'm just describing history. That's just, if you want to talk about the history of the United States, you have to talk about these structures. So, but any laws that target critical race theory, that target structural racism, that target teaching structures as part of history, will result in making it illegal to teach important history, because history of a country is history of structures. And so if you can't teach history of structures, you can only teach history of individuals. And then you make it seem that history is made out of the exploits of individuals. The civil rights movement was not a structural system of resistance. It was one great man. And so eliminating structures is not some targeted move to eliminate some ideology. It's actually eliminating history. It's eliminating how you tell history. And replacing it with history of individuals, which is, of course, how neoliberal ideology works.
Let's have one last question. One of my students raises a question about Nigeria, but let's put this in a more general context, if we may.
I'm going to go. My computer's dying, so I'm going to go from my very intellectual space of my office to my kitchen where I actually work.
Okay. The question is this, and it's the last question, and that is, how would it be possible for people in places like Nigeria and other places, to react against the fascist politics and moves? In a very general sense, how would you begin to articulate that question?
Yes, very good. How do we have education? First of all, you need to, I mean, there's a basic question of, focus on the schools, don't leave out the schools in strategies of resistance. They're central because the schools are what depoliticize people in authoritarian structures. So you have to repoliticize people. So the question really becomes, what does an education for freedom look like? And that's going to involve, as Paulo Freire has shown, I would say, educational practices that cultivate a sense of autonomy and self-determination. And so you see this, like I'm reading about the post-war German educational system, and it very much involved empowering students. It very much involved, having students have autonomy over the classroom. This is obviously a theme, and I'm just going to repeat Freire here. For when Freire, that aspect, that sort of historically, looking at the Germany is one of the most healthy for many decades. Germany was one of the healthiest liberal democracies. So I think you do need to look at what happened after the war to see how it emerged that way. And it wasn't like they replaced the Nazi educational system by an educational system that said, you must now bow down to democracy. Instead, they democratized the students by giving them a large degree of autonomy. So it wasn't like replacing an educational system that dominated them with an educational system that yelled at them about democracy. It was about giving them autonomy. And then there's the points that Freire makes about the banking system of education, that you have to represent the world as changeable. And so you can't just write it as a list of facts. You can't have schools that simply involve people regurgitating facts. This is Freire's critique of the banking conception of education. So insofar as, say, for instance, Kenya's schools, they produce a lot of people who have remarkable knowledge of things, but they're quite authoritarian character. That kind of method of schooling is not one that will end the kind of autonomy that underlies democracy.
I think it's very important to end on this notion that schools are really sites of struggle, that power is not just about domination, that schools have to be linked to some sort of vision that seems reasonable in terms of what it means to link education to questions of engaged citizenship. And finally, in some way, how to begin to talk about educated hope, in ways in which you not only get beyond learned helplessness and learned illiteracy, but you get beyond the fact that you can embrace a sense of agency, both individually and collectively, Listen, we want to thank you very much. That was enormously informative. I'm sure that this will attract an enormous number of people online. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Henry. It is an honor to be in conversation with you.
Oh, it's an honor to have you here. We're all honored, believe me, and we've learned a lot. Thanks again. Bye-bye.